and welcome to Mark and Carrie, a podcast presented by the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. Hello, Blyth. Happy 2023.
And happy 2023 to you as well. I see we now have to put the corporate sponsor on the front.
Yes, we do. And we'll be pausing for commercial breaks as well.
Excellent, excellent. So, we start a new year, and guess what? Familiar tragedy.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think over the last 4 days, there have been consistent public shootings, something that was happening throughout the fall and the winter. The most recent was this morning in Half Moon Bay, just south of San Francisco, and then the one that was in Southern California in Monterey Park, which is an Asian American community in Los Angeles, as they were celebrating the Lunar New Year.
So is there any sense in trying to draw individual lessons from each of these and aggregate them up, as social scientists like to do? Or is it just simply the case that we have a sick culture and people have access to weapons and really bad things happen in lots of different communities?
I mean, I would like that there'd be some rational reason for this, but I think it's what you just described. And this ties into, of course, what we'll talk about later, which is Congress. But there's just no political will. I mean, the more this keeps happening, of course, you get, thoughts and prayers, and this is so horrible. But, the Congress is just unwilling to move on this. I mean, there was some movement in the fall around background checks, but nothing that even comes close to the assault weapons bill.
Right, but the guy in the first one was, 72 years old?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure he would have passed any background check that you wanted.
Yeah.
So, my question is, not to exculpate or to say that the status quo is acceptable. It's not. But really, beyond sort of shouting at Congress to do more, what specifically could they do? I mean, I'm trying to imagine the United Kingdom after they had a gun tragedy called Dunblane in the 1980s, or whether it was New Zealand or Australia when they had their Port Arthur massacre. There was just a sort of right, no more guns, right?
Yeah.
And in smaller countries where gun ownership is actually a lot less common, I can imagine you can kind of get away with that when the vast majority of public opinion is with you. But it's not just kind of electoral politics. I mean, there are more guns than people.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, the frame has changed over the years from gun control, that is a gun problem, to now mental health, which I believe. I mean, but mental health is such a broadly defined term as well. I mean, what does that actually mean? I mean, it's so many of the same things that we've talked about in the past. It's usually men. It's usually men that, that are living by themselves, aren't necessarily connected to all of the various things that a person might be connected to. And I don't know. I mean, as long as the Second Amendment is still here, you don't see any sort of big policy measure.
Yeah, but not to belabor the point. I mean, imagine you had a magic wand, right? And you could basically do the policy measure. What would it be? What would actually really try and put a crimp in this?
Yeah, I know, right? Because if you do an assault weapons ban, there's still the presence of guns that will be out and available. And
I believe in both of these recent killings, it was pistols.
Yeah. And then you do the sort of individual level behavioral stuff of trying to build more community for people, whatever that means. And that sort of stuff. I mean, that's like a whole, the social capital sort of thing. I guess I always think we've become so angry, and now that anger is really outpouring into our public lives. And, we talk about how other countries are so violent and dangerous. I mean, we're just as violent and dangerous as other places.
No, we're way off the scale. I mean, if you look at any of these graphs in terms of, homicides, attempted homicide, whatever, it's like, wow, we are number one.
Yeah.
By a factor of 10, if not more.
What's your take on this in terms of the magic wand policy?
Well, it's just, after, the school shootings and now these things and, just one mass shooting a month, nightclubs, everything's been hit. I don't think there's a tipping point anymore. I think we've become sadly inured to it. Yeah. And it's also such a sort of an endemic part of what American culture has become. I'm not sure there's actually a solution other than literally you need to take all the guns away from people, and that's never going to happen. Mm-hmm. So, unfortunately, it just becomes this kind of awful thing that we live with because that's who we are. One of the things that stuck with me after 2016 and the Trump election was lots of liberals saying, this is not who we are. And I just kept thinking to myself, no, this really is who you are.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? We need to stop pretending. The first step is recognition.
Yeah.
This is who you are.
Yeah.
So sticking with California, it's went from a summer of intense drought on top of the longest drought in history to atmospheric rivers. Have you ever heard of these things?
No, I haven't. And I'm laughing only because I'm laughing at gallows humor. I mean, California it really has been like the ark and like, every other biblical theme that I can think of. And, I read an article that San Francisco has become such a city where no one wants to live because of the floods. There was raw sewage then in the streets, and just thinking about, this town that, has so much money, blah, 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 and they can't even control their, the sewers. I had not heard of that. And it just looked like rain on top of rain on top of rain. And the people, walking through the hip wastewater. I mean, they're still in a drought stage.
Right. Because it falls down so fast on Earth that is so dry and compacted that it doesn't really absorb it. I saw one interesting piece on this that basically some people in the wine country are very happy about this because, they are actually going to have a fantastic vintage because of all this water. Production was down to 1/3 of what it was before, and now we're going to have a bumper year. So at least somebody's getting the upside. But the problem with this is to actually deal with it, you need all those really difficult things that we're not very good at, like public investment, to build things like, new aquifer supplies and reservoirs and all those things that you could do that would catch it. But of course, that would require long-term planning and actually not having a chronic aversion to debt. Because debt is how you do investment. But, we've been there before. Maybe if this continues year after year, though, there could be an upside in it. The only way to deal with it is to adequately infrastructure the hell out of it. So maybe there's an upside to this.
I mean, all the money that came from Biden's infrastructure bill, you think rebuilding of old dams, like all the stuff that needs to be done. But I mean, California really feels like it's experiencing all the stuff that the rest of the country, or at least big parts of it, haven't yet hit. Though, I mean, there are random tornadoes all the time, and like all this other random weather. So I don't know that what I just said is actually accurate of anything. But to what you just said about debt led me to think about where we are right now. And actually, I don't know where we are with the debt ceiling negotiations, because I don't know if Janet Yellen came out and was like, we're on the verge. Everybody get ready to boil their water and just eat that for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But I don't know where they are, where the White House is in this game with Congress.
As I understand it, and I try not to understand it because it's just one of those brilliant self-inflicted wounds that we do to ourselves every single time. This is the result of basically McCarthy's. I mean, we'll have to talk about McCarthy's sort of like, do you like me? Will you date me? Was it 11 times, 12 times? 15 times. Oh my God, 15. Right. So he's basically promised all the UFO files, all the Kennedy files, and the location of the Raiders of the Lost Ark to the loonies in exchange for doing this. This is the payoff that you actually get this. So I think the White House strategy is basically let them do it because it just makes them look like loonies, and ultimately they'll fold. Now, will they ultimately fold? See, I don't watch the day-to-day on this because I don't think it's interesting. Ultimately, it's a binary. You're either going to increase the debt ceiling, which is just a stupid way of saying, do you have the resources to pay your bills? Yes. Are you going to do it? You probably should, right? So are they going to pay the bills, or are they going to start defaulting on the bills? If they do, that's an act of self-harm. And I can imagine there are many members of the Republican caucus who really are just like, come on, let's just burn it all down, right? Will they get that far? Maybe. I think there's a few of them that want to try and do that. Then if the White House isn't managing the situation as you actually go into default, it's interesting. We know this from other countries. You don't just go straight to default. You go into a technical default. Then the technical default is adjudicated upon whether it's still really a technical default or a real default, right? So there'll be lots of shenanigans around this. But at the end of the day, we can pay our bills. Right? And they're it's so bonkers. It's bills we owe to ourselves by and large. It's absurd, right? So there is no fiscal crisis. There is simply a refusal to pay your bills. And the weird thing about this is the party of fiscal probity, that if you said to them, should you repay your debts and should you pay your bills? You're like, absolutely. That's the one thing you should always do. Okay, so why are you then doing this? It's weird.
I mean, back to your dating analogy, it really is then the technical default is just we're on a break. Then we're working our way towards something much larger. But I think the far right, the Lauren Boeberts and the Marjorie Taylor Greens have said, well, let's just do this and see what happens, because it's never happened before. So it can't be that bad.
Well, I mean, lots of people haven't had cancer before, but that's not an argument for getting cancer,
Yes.
is it? Yeah. I mean, ultimately, though, they may be right in a perverse way, which is to say, if people think the United States can't pay its bills, then maybe there's a problem. But given that they can, you could probably default for a couple of weeks and people will freak out. And of course, the rating agencies will rate you from AA to single A, and everyone will go, woo, and your bond prices will spike a little bit. But, will it be a permanent state? Will it be constantly like this? Mm-hmm. Maybe. I mean, we've got standoffs now over everything. So maybe we just never pay bills anymore, right?
Well, I think that's the bigger question I have is, why does this always come around it feels like every other month, but why can't there just be a long-term thing?
Because they don't want a long-term thing. They want to be able, if the Democrats win, it's very useful to have this thing, because then you can just say, they're spending like drunken sailors again. And then, you beat your chest and all the rest of it. And, we have to draw a line in the sand. And you go, all right, but if that's true, then really the yield on our debt should be like at Argentina levels, right? Because we've spent more than we've got and we're totally bankrupt, right? So then why is it still the global safe asset? Why are rates basically a response directly of the Fed's desire to do whatever it wants on inflation rather than being driven by random desires of out-of-control bond markets? I mean, it's just, at the end of the day, rubbish.
So you're saying, interestingly enough, that it's all politics.
What an absolute shocker.
Right. I mean, for me, the minutia was really interesting to read about. But I think the big thing, which is, of course, no surprise to anybody, is that it's just a preview of what's to come, which is to say that very little will get done. He's always going to have to be negotiating with that part of his party. I mean, there were interesting things in the negotiations that I think the far left, the Squad, was really interested in. Right, take term limits for committee chairs, really remove some of the power from the leadership and give it to committees, all that sort of stuff. I think on the real detailed side of things, I thought it was most interesting that there are 3 hard right people on the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee in the House dictates everything. And so we'll see what actually gets to the floor for real votes, because they're going to be the real sticklers to make sure that they get what they want to the floor.
So does that enable or disable them, right? If they're sticklers about rules, that implies even less happens. Can they make more happen by being on the Rules Committee, or is it just a block?
Well, right. They can make more happen that they want to see happen. I mean, the other thing that, that I think squishy Lib Dems are hoping is that the hard right and the left come together to to stop whatever the majority of the committee wants to do. I don't think that's probably will happen, but it gives them a lot of power. A long-term serving congressman from southeastern Michigan, John Dingell, he had this famous quote that said, he said on the Rules Committee, and he said, you control substance and I control the rules, and I'll screw you every time. And that's just, the Rules Committee, they really are the gatekeepers, as you just described.
Interesting. So let's switch to some Democrat bashing now.
Good.
So after outrage and fought outrage about the fact that Donald Trump may or may not have had some files about Macron lying around Mar-a-Lago, it turns out that Joe keeps top secret stuff in his Corvette. Is that right? To it.
But then what was even more interesting is that he didn't know they were there. I mean, this is stuff left over from the Obama presidency.
How can stuff be left over from the Obama presidency in his car?
I don't know. You don't, this is the point, right? Donald Trump is a clown. He doesn't know what he's doing. I'm a pro. I've been doing this for a long time. And yet you still have it's still in your glove box? What?
Yeah, but this whole thing strikes me as a bit weird. I mean, if it's Obama level stuff in his car that he's had in storage and he completely forgot about, well, we're all human, right? But not that I'm exculpating here, right? But isn't the whole thing kind of just an example of how pathetic politics has become? Okay, Trump has some files that he's kept. He used to be president. Some people used to take the ashtrays home. when they left the hotel, right? Some people take souvenirs. Some people take who knows what Harry Truman smuggled out of the White House, right? But we just didn't care. Now it's like, oh my God, Trump has done something terrible again because he's a terrible man. Blah, blah, blah. So then, of course, when you set up that as the standard, it turns out that people who handle sensitive government documents, like the government, end up maybe taking them home for the weekend. And then you've got a problem. I mean, isn't this just all kind of pathetic?
Yes, it is. A new low for patheticness, I don't know if that's a word, is then this just opens the door to all the investigations that the Kevin McCarthy-led Congress is going to do. And so it's the confidential documents found in the garage. But also, clearly, Hunter Biden's laptop is there, along with his gigantic stash of cocaine that is sold out of his dad's garage. So it's like, you're just like, what are you guys doing? I mean, how did the White House not know about this?
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me as, one salient difference might be that sort of like the person with the sensitive files is the current sitting president rather than the person who used to be president. Yeah. But, let's not split hairs on this one. The whole thing seems to be a bit mad.
Well, I know you've been traveling. Have you been to Davos with your fellow peers?
No. Once again, I think the advert just got lost. The advert. I think the invitation just got lost in the post somewhere. No, they had a sort of a face-off between left and right, I believe, in the form of Neil Ferguson, my countryman, representing the right and freedom and all good things, and then Adam Tooze, that noted communist, arguing for actually taxing people with billions. No, the entire thing is just beyond farcical at this point. I did a tweet a couple of years ago where I went back through World Economic Forum reports about what was going to happen next year.
Yeah.
And, apparently by this point in time, we're in 2023, right? We should all have cyber connectivity in our brains directly into the 5G metaverse.
Yeah,
It's just rich people talking bollocks to each other and then going skiing. just not even interesting. Move on. Tell you what is interesting, though. The UK.
Oh, but tell me more.
Well, I don't know if you've been following this, but just when you think you're just going to get a week without a scandal, then you get another scandal. So the latest one, and I'm trying to get this right because the details are, of course, murky and subject to parliamentary investigation, and in no way am I impugning the characters of anyone involved. But it seems there's a connection between the person who arranged an 800 grand loan for Boris Johnson, a man who needs 800 grand just to basically pay off his family members, by the way.
Okay.
And the guy who became the head of the BBC. I'm not sure what the connection is. And then it turns out the chair of the Tory party, who's the guy who set up the YouGov polling organisation, may or may not, I have heard, be non-compliant with certain tax matters.
Oh, geez.
So it really, again, it's just like phenomenally rich people who should know better, who spend most of their time telling everyone else that we don't have any money and we can't pay for anything, or just spend all their time not paying their taxes.
Yeah.
And then they fly to Davos to talk about how clever they are. It's just like, oh God.
And then what I'm going to do to help the world with all my gigantic sums of money that I work so hard for, and let me
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, once we all have cybernetic interfaces and we can directly tap through 5G into the wired world and into the meta.
Yeah.
I mean, then we don't have to worry about poverty or healthcare, right?
No. Although, have you tried GPT at all?
I can't comment. I think I'm going to plagiarize myself.
Oh, wait. Well, this is one of the questions I had is that, I just was playing around with it, and it does, it can give you a sonnet, and so it's really impressive in that way. But, I also am convinced that there are little people in my computer that are actually doing this as opposed to the actual intelligence. But, maybe that'll be implanted into our brains as well, and that'll make us even smarter.
Well, we need to have a conversation about this, we meaning us in higher education, right? So if this thing can basically do the following, I'm about to do a class on sort of global money.
Okay.
And let's say that I say that the most cited authors on this are A, B, and C. And I say, write me 1,500 words on the end of the Bretton Woods regime with a focus on the works of A, B, and C. And it can do that.
Yeah.
Then what do I do in terms of signing essays?
I know, right? Yeah.
Right? I mean, if we need an AI bot to sniff out writing by an AI bot, we're done.
Yep. Yeah.
Right. So I think we're back. I mean, if we go down this line, I've got this terrible feeling that we're going to be back to, and the assessment for this class, rather than being continuous assessment based upon projects and particularly papers, is going to have to be basically quizzes.
Yeah.
It's going to have to be, back to blue book midterms, because how else are you going to figure out if people actually have been doing the course or whether an AI assistant is doing all the work for them?
Yeah, I did think about this. I mean, if I could get it to write a paper, an academic paper for me, like who actually wrote the paper? I mean, yeah, who wrote the paper? I mean, it's like,
well, there was a piece in Nature about this. They've just adjudicated at some level of authority that AI assistants can't be listed as authors because they can't give consent.
Oh, that's super interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
So even if you use it, then you're using it more than a tool. If it generates, it's an author, but it can't be an author because it can't give consent.
Right.
I mean, we're already into sort of like Asimov's paradox of robotic life at this point.
Yeah. Wow. Huh.
Fun times.
Yeah, and it can't give consent. Wow. Okay.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, I really have to think about that. Yeah. In a similar vein, but very different. But just thinking about the tech world, Microsoft just announced this week that they're laying off another 10,000 people. There are all the round of layoffs just before the holidays. Amazon, Meta, Salesforce, Twitter, etc. It seems to me that this is a very small percentage of the population, and that these are probably the people that can be rehired the most quickly out of anybody who gets laid off. But does this signal to you anything about the larger economy, or is it just one of those things that the mainstream media is focused on and it's just a headline?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, like the total number of people out of the whole labor force that work directly for the FANGs or for FANGs type companies is, I think, about 4% of the labor market. So it's not that big. Secondly, if they are the ones that are skilled, they can get hired back, etc. Right? But a really simple way to think about this is an analogy with the stock market. Go back to the pandemic, right? Remember when the stock market like basically went up 60%?
Yes.
And anybody at all who had decided to short hotels and airlines and go long tech was an investment genius, right? So the index like goes up 60%, and then the next year it goes down by 30%. So you're still up half of that difference that you got. You're still up half that boost, but it feels like a loss. Now, let's think about what happened to all these firms. They are all the people that basically made hay during the pandemic. They're the people that added delivery drivers. Yep. They're the people that invested all that money into the metaverse that nobody wants, whatever, right? And eventually it turns out that when things normalize, you kind of have to get rid of all those people you've overhired.
Yeah. Yeah, right.
That's it.
Right.
Nothing to see. Move along. It's called mean reversion. It happens all the time. That's it. There's one way that this is getting interesting. There are these firms, that's activist hedge funds, that get 2, 3, 4% of a company's shares, which gives them a controlling stake because the shares are so diversely held, if that's a phrase, but you know what I mean. And then they can start basically telling the board what to do. So a couple of these funds are now basically getting into tech land, and that's new for them because they've never done that before. When tech was on the up, you're not going to try and get in there with a minority position and tell the board what to do. Mm-hmm. Now that they're a little bit weaker, some of that's beginning to happen, which just suggests that tech is just becoming more of an ordinary sector rather than the extraordinary sector. But then again, to go back to our AI bot stuff, right? If that really, Microsoft has just decided to invest billions in this chatbot thing. Yep. So, maybe that is the thing that opens up and transforms, the next wave of tech. We don't know.
Yeah. But I get your point that they hired so much during the pandemic. And so in some ways, they're just back to zero. They hired so much and they laid off. And so they're just back to where they were pre-pandemic hiring. Right.
All right, so enough of this sort of like floating around in the UK and the US. Let's go somewhere else. And of course, the bleeding sore of humanity is, of course, Ukraine.
Yes.
And, so now the Ukrainians are saying the Russians are getting ready for a big offensive. We need to go on the offensive. You need to give us these tanks. There's been this big stramash, and the Germans, who basically at the end of the day care more about their economic model and selling exports than they do about anything else, are a bit hesitant to just do that, because that means the end of any future relationship with Russia. And then they have this feeling, at least German industry, that unless they have access to cheap Russian inputs, they will never be competitive against the Chinese. So this becomes an existential question for German industry, in a sense. That's one interpretation. It's vaguely possible. The other one is that we're just not thinking this through. So you know that you're up against a regime that has a win at all cost mentality. Putin has staked his credibility, if not his life, on winning this thing. So every time that you provide a new technology that gives the Ukrainians an advantage, which you should, then what happens is they need to double down on their efforts, and it makes the conflict perhaps more intense, more destructive even than it will be. Now, at the end of the day, if you've decided that Putin is bluffing, he will never use nukes, nobody will ever use nukes, and we need to defeat this guy, then you have to supply the tanks, because otherwise the Ukrainians can't do what they need to do. But if you do supply the tanks and you really change the impetus on the battlefield, who's to say that he doesn't start using battlefield nuclear weapons against those tanks?
Right.
And if he does, what do you do next? Right? Once the genie's out of the bottle, where do you go with this one? And, this seems to me the bit of, if you make a bet that he's never going to use them, then everything you do makes sense. If you make a bet that it is highly possible he will use them, it's not clear that this strategy is going to lead to anything other than that.
Your interpretation about the relationship between Russia and China is vastly different than what reading just the headline news that, the reluctance of Germany to give the Panthers, they could come up with great names for these things too. Yes. Based on World War II, and, they demilitarized and blah, blah, blah. So that's so much more interesting, the political chessboard that's being played right now.
It's political economy, follow the money.
Yes.
Right? I mean, at the end of the day, if they torch their relationship with Russia, what happens to the big German chemical manufacturers who need tons of gas for their operations?
Yeah.
Are they going to get that from American LNG that's been bid up in price all the time?
Right.
If you have a look, I mean, this is interesting. This takes us into another direction, but I got an email from an analyst this morning checking this out. If you look at, I think it was West Texas crude, there seems to be a floor price of about 70. It's just not dropping below that. And even though gasoline consumption in the United States is flattened and has actually declined a little bit since the pandemic, China's opening up again. So once China goes full pelt on this stuff, then basically that oil price is going to go back up, gas prices are going to go back up, and then inflation's going to go back up. So, we're not out of the woods on this one yet. There's this feeling that like inflation has turned, and if we just supply tanks to Ukraine, all will be well. I'm not convinced that that's really following through.
On that note, it has been interesting looking at just the view of the American press over the last few weeks about this sort of China as much more vulnerable than it has in the past, like the switching COVID policy. I mean, the declining population thing, I just shrugged my shoulders. Like, didn't demographers predict this like 50 years ago? And now like the Washington Post is like, there's no more people left in China, and then they show a picture of like a really busy street, and you're like, this doesn't quite.
Yeah,
anyway,
I know. Yeah, it doesn't. No, it's funny. I mean, if you're old enough like me, I remember the last time this was done. It was done with Japan.
Oh yeah, right.
Exactly the same stories, right? Yeah. I mean, it was like, yes, but they're an old society, so their technological advancement won't really matter. And at the end of the day, USA will win against the terrible Japanese. And it was just, I mean, honestly, word for word. Yeah. I mean, it's funny. There's people in DC who kind of like, they're like cicadas. They come out of the ground every 17 years.
Yeah.
And the last time they were visible was like they were banging on about Japan and trade deficits or whatever. And now, the same people are back and it's all about China. And it's like, oh, for God, it's like a cottage industry.
Yeah. Oh, that's really funny. Just switch out Japan and put in China. Yeah. And have
the one who does have a problem with this, the Japanese said this yesterday, in fact, is like, they really do have a problem because they just can't do immigration, right? Yeah. And they are astonishingly old. So they are actually, I think now 26% of the population is over 65. And, you can automate a lot of stuff, but at the end of the day, an economy is nothing more than the number of people, the number of hours work, and the capital you work with. They've got good capital, but they're running out of people. QED, the place shrinks. That's it. Look at it this way. I mean, one of the major problems that we have with climate change is trying to square energy production and consumption with GDP growth. So maybe if we all just shrink a little,
Yeah.
Maybe that helps.
Yeah.
That's the degrowth argument. You just do it by not having any kids.
Well, in Japan is interesting because, of course, trying to increase their population and giving financial incentives to women to have more babies, which has really gone nowhere too. So
yeah, it doesn't work anywhere.
Yeah.
So, no, one of the fascinating things with that, apparently, Len Seabrook told me this one ages ago. Sorry for invoking you there, Len, but your name popped up. That when you look at immigrant populations, the first generation maintains the fertility of the home country.
Okay.
The second one basically closes the gap to the host country by about 2/3. And then by the third generation, they're completely normalized to whatever they do in that country.
Oh, whoa. Okay.
So given that you move from poor to rich, and rich has less kids, it's just a machine for generating less growth.
Right.
Then there's my favorite one, which I talk about all the time, which is the total collapse of male sperm counts around the world as well.
Right.
Yeah. So throw that into the mix, and it's like, we won't be... if it wasn't for immigration, and it's been historically low for the past 2 years, the American population growth has come to a halt, right?
Yeah.
We're all in the same boat here.
Yeah. Well, maybe this is then the solution to climate change is exactly what you just said, the degrowth. Like, the population stops growing, we use less stuff.
Don't have any kids.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, literally after 2 generations, problem solved, except there's no more human civilization. But what can you do?
It's okay. We're like in some spaceship in the sky with our AI embed.
With our millionaires from who have been to Davos.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Right? They'll take their personal spaceships and we'll colonize Mars because it's such a nice place.
Yeah, it's so nice in the summer.
So we're winding up now. Just a couple of things to finish with. You've heard of this thing called the euro, right?
I have, yeah, way back.
Have you heard of the SUR?
No, I haven't.
The SUR, I think I'm getting this right, which is really weird because in English it sounds like the thing that you pump poop through.
Yeah.
The SUR is the proposed joint currency between Argentina and Brazil, which really begs the question, why would the Brazilians want to do this? I suppose they're going to pull out all the same arguments that you did for Europe about, lower transactions costs, and maybe they'll have a digital currency but maintain their own currencies, whatever. But it's funny, I can't help think that sort of like currencies now are one of the things that politicians turn to, like bike lanes. So here's the awful truth about bike lanes in dense cities, right? New York's a classic example. When you put in bike lanes, you reduce the available space for traffic to flow.
Okay.
So you end up with more congestion, because you don't reduce the number of cars or trucks.
Right.
And you end up with more pollution. So you end up with like a small number of bikers breathing in toxicity while no one gets anywhere fast.
Right.
But everybody does it because it's one of those things you can be seen to do, and then you've got a result you can point to in 4 years. I can't help but think, but sort of like, talking about money and currencies and these types of projects has become the equivalent of that for politicians, right? Fixing Argentina's long-run productivity problem, really hard, right? Fixing Brazil's totally weird stratified culture and polarized politics, really hard. Maybe you could just have a joint currency and celebrate that instead.
I think the name, when you said it, sounded kind of cool too.
That's it. How many sur is it to the dollar? Very interesting.
Like problem solved. Okay, you check that off the list of things to do.
You got any closers? What did you find it was weird this week?
I do. Well, this is much lighter than a unified currency in South America. And this goes back to Davos and, what are the world's richest men doing with their money that they work so hard to get? And this is Peter Thiel. So he, in the fall, launched a conservative dating app called The Right Stuff. And at first, there were a number of downloads, like I think 44,000 downloads in November when it first appeared. But now it's like at 11,000. And just as a point of comparison, Tinder gets about 1 million, about 900,000 a month. So these are pretty low numbers. So it looks like The Right Stuff is not going in the right direction. I think it has like a 2.1 rating in the Apple Store as well. And I guess it just made me laugh that, first of all, I don't know why Peter Thiel is like backing a dating app, but also that it joins a number of sort of right-leaning, just like there are left-leaning dating apps. And one of the remarks in the report, because I was doing a deep dive into hard news, was that The Right Stuff was just all Mitch McConnell staffers looking for a hookup. So I just thought that was funny, and
it's a kind of a weird. I mean, when people are rich enough to obsess about politics, I guess this is what you do with your time when you're staring mortality down the face when the blood transfusions no longer work. But it does beg a question. I mean, thankfully, I don't do Tinder or any of these things. I'm far too old, and everything's good at home. We're fine, right? But if I did, would politics be the first thing I think of?
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, is it really just like, well, most important to me is that someone has got a working knowledge of Marxism and is a sort of, an eco-feminist. That's my two main criteria right there. And maybe for some people it is, but I just don't think I think this way, or most people really think this way. It's a vanity project that's stupid.
Yeah. I mean, that's really all that needs to be said. On the other side of, or not on the other side, but one last thing that we have to talk about is Prince Harry's book, Spare.
Didn't we talk about it last time?
No, it hadn't been released yet. It had.
But we said everything that we possibly could say, didn't we?
There's so much more to say. So get ready, listeners.
All right, go.
We got an hour.
You've got 2 minutes. Go.
Here's what I had to say. I mean, there's lots of revelations in it, and he's really mad at his family as well. And so, he's written like
quite right. They're a mad family.
400-page book about it. I think the stuff that. I mean, he comes across, I think, as a sympathetic human / someone who just can't let go of anything at all. I think the thing that's most fascinating to me is that he has said that there was enough for 2 books. And so is there a second book waiting out there for us? And what will it be called? Did you listen to any of the excerpts from it or pay any attention?
Nothing. I mean, everything gets sort of excerpted and distilled down, and here's the main points and all that sort of stuff. There was a kind of like brilliant, tragic mini review in The Guardian, which I posted on Twitter because I thought it was quite funny. Other people thought it was really kind of harsh. But no, I mean, ultimately, it's just he's a sad character trapped in a sad family drama with the weirdest family in Britain.
Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty much it. And just crazy things to think about. They're not from the book, but just sort of, has happened to them as a couple, right? So imagine you're Meghan Markle, right? You're a self-made bootstrapper. You were pulling in 70G an episode on a long-running series. Everything's fine. Your world's good. And you meet this guy and you're like, all right, whatever, we'll go for it, right? And one of the first things they say to you is, please hand over your passport. You're no longer in control of where you travel.
Yeah.
And please hand over your driver's license because you'll never drive yourself again.
Yeah.
And that's just a glimpse into what is normality for this quote-unquote family. And there's a bit in the book, apparently, and this is the only bit that I found any resonance with from Harry's point, really, was he imagines, apparently, at one point, what's it like to be able to make your own friends?
Yeah. I mean,
right?
Yeah.
Because, it's a bit like, it's the curse of the rich, right?
Yep.
When you're rich and your friends are normal, you tend to no longer be normal. Tend to no longer be friends with them. Because what happens is at some point you'll do them a favor because you got all that money. And to you, it's nothing, but to them, it's an enormous amount of money. What it does is it creates a debt obligation.
Yep.
Even if you never have to pay it back, you're indebted to this person. So the relationship becomes one of sort of servitude and keeping you happy. And then you hate that and the thing breaks. It's just all crap, right? Now just substitute money for royal, right?
Yeah.
And yes, people will always be friendly to you, but in a sense, it's kind of like all pre-programmed as to who your friend is, what your social circles are, etc. And people always relate to you as this thing. Right? Rather than actually just as a normal person. So I can relate to sort of, the sadness of like never being normal. But at the same time, that's what enables you to write a book like this and basically spoff 150 million out of Netflix.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm not that sympathetic at the end of the day.
Yeah. No, but I think your point about that there's just a weird family in general, like, yeah. And I think that probably comes through pretty clearly.
I love the image of the current King of England wandering around a palace in his slippers and dressing gown holding a teddy bear.
Or doing headstands in his underpants. Yeah. And
could you think of anything more dysfunctionally British? It's just brilliant.
Oh, geez. Well, this seems like a good place to maybe end, but start 2023.
Well, exactly. I mean, let's think about all the fabulous fun things that we've spoken about. I mean, we opened with the tragedy of gun violence, our inability to do anything useful with 75 trillion tons of water, why we're having trouble paying our bills when we don't have trouble paying our bills, why Kevin tried 15 times to get a job nobody with the right mind would want, why Joe leaves things in his car, why the Tory party manages to get more corrupt every single week, why tech layoffs don't matter, Ukraine may be much more dangerous than we think, and why Brazil would possibly want to get into bed with Argentina for currency.
Yeah.
Oh, and the right stuff.
Yes, right. And we end with
Wow.
Prince Charles walking around, or King with a teddy bear.
King Charles and the teddy bear.
Yeah.
I mean, I think all I can say, having summed all that up, is a great quote from a series from Britain called Dad's Army, which was about these pensioner volunteers in the Home Guard in 1940 on the edge of the Germans' invasion. And there was a Scottish character in there who was one of the old soldiers. And he only ever said one thing: "We're doomed. Doomed." Outlook bleak. Forecast doomed.
Great to see you.
I'll keep smiling though. So
yes.
you. All right. See you in a few weeks.
Bye. Thank you for listening. Talk to you soon.
Bye.